Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. When I think back to that year in the mountains, it always starts with the way the road narrowed as I drove up into Appalachia for the first time. The way the interstate fell away behind me and the hills rose up like dark green walls on either side. I was 21 and convinced that a year as a live-in nanny in rural West Virginia would be quiet, wholesome, almost healing after a messy breakup and a string of dead-end jobs back in Ohio. The Harper family had found me through an online childcare site. They lived outside a little town called Willow Gap, which I had to look up twice because I wasn't sure it really existed. On the phone, Denise Harper sounded warm and tired in that way mothers often do, apologizing for the noise in the background, telling me they just needed an extra set of hands now that her husband Mark was working swing shifts at the gas plant down in the valley. The pictures she sent showed a peeling white farmhouse at the end of a gravel driveway, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs, and a yard that backed straight into a wall of trees. It looked like the kind of place where nothing truly bad could happen. I arrived in late August, when the air was heavy and humming with insects, and the hills were as green as the pictures promised. The house was older, up close, its boards gray and tired. But there were flower boxes on the porch and a tire swing hanging from a maple tree out front, and that felt like a good sign. Denise gave me a quick hug on the steps, smelling of coffee and hospital soap, talking too fast and apologizing for the mess inside. Mark shook my hand, his knuckles stained with oil and something like coal dust, and told me it'd fit right in up here in a tone that sounded more hopeful than certain. Their boys, he said, were good kids, just spirited. I met the older one first. Eli was 12, lanky, with a mop of sun-bleached hair and the sullen friendliness of a kid who would rather be anywhere else but is too polite to say so. He shook my hand because his mother told him to, then went back to kicking a soccer ball against the side of the shed. The younger one watched from the edge of the porch, half hidden behind a post. His name was Caleb, 9 years old, skinny in that way that makes kids look almost fragile, with dark hair that fell into his eyes. When Denise called him over, he came, but slowly, as if he were deciding something. Up close, I saw that his eyes were a washed-out kind of blue that didn't quite match the rest of his face. He looked at me for a long time without speaking, gaze steady and unblinking, and the silence stretched just a second too long. When he finally did speak, his voice was soft and flat, asking if I was the girl who's supposed to stay this time, a phrase that lodged itself somewhere in my chest. Denise laughed it off, said they'd had a couple of sitters from town who hadn't lasted through the winter, blamed the long drive into Willow Gap and the weird hours. I wanted to believe her. I told myself that all families had their quirks. My room was upstairs at the far end of the hallway, under the sloped roof where the walls creaked at night and the windows looked out over the tree line. It wasn't fancy, a narrow bed, a dresser, a small desk with one wobbly leg, but it was mine, with a faded quilt and a view of the hollow that dipped down behind the house. From my window, the forest seemed to lean inward, steep hills rising on either side, suffocating and beautiful all at once. My first weeks settled into a routine, getting the boys up for school, packing lunches, trying to keep the kitchen from collapsing under the weight of muddy boots and empty cereal boxes. Eli was easy enough. He liked video games and soccer and complaining about homework. Caleb was different. He didn't throw tantrums or act out in obvious ways. He just had this way of drifting in and out of rooms without sound, appearing in doorways, standing in the corner of my eye. I'd turn around at the sink and find him watching me from the kitchen table, arms folded, expression blank. I'd be folding laundry and look up to see him in the hallway, head tilted like he was trying to solve a puzzle. When I tried to draw him out, he'd answer in short, clipped phrases that felt rehearsed, like he was playing at what a normal kid might say. There were little things that bothered me that I didn't know how to name at the time. The way he seemed to know exactly where my phone and keys were, even when I could have sworn he'd left them somewhere else. The way he always walked on the very edge of the porch, fingertips trailing along the railing, eyes flicking to the steep drop into the hollow as if he were measuring the distance. The way the family dog, an old beagle named Rusty, kept a careful arc around him, tail low, ears flattened, only relaxing when Caleb left the room. At night, the house took on a different presence. Out in the hollow, the tree frogs and cicadas could be loud enough to sound almost like static, and every now and then a distant train would wail from the valley below. The rafters creaked, the old pipes moaned, and wind pushed branches against the siding so that it sometimes felt like the forest was knocking to be let in. I told myself every old house makes strange noises and that I was just a city girl not used to this kind of dark. Still, I started sleeping with a small lamp on my nightstand, turned to its lowest setting, a little circle of yellow in the otherwise thick black. The first time things went from unsettling to truly frightening. It was barely October. The nights had turned cooler, and the leaves on the ridge were just starting to burn red and orange. Id had a long day. Denise had picked up an extra shift, and Mark was working nights, so I'd done dinner, baths, and homework by myself. By the time I climbed the stairs to my room, my body ached in that heavy, satisfying way that promised deep sleep. I remember thinking, just 5 minutes, and he'll be out. I pulled back my quilt in one tired motion and reached to smooth the fitted sheet underneath my palm, brushing over something that didn't feel right, rough, and sharp and wrong against my skin. I jerked my hand back on instinct and saw a thin line of red bead along the pad of my index finger. For a second, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I leaned closer and saw the faint glint of light along countless tiny edges. Someone had spread a dusting of broken glass all over my mattress, fine and glittering, almost invisible until you touched it. Mixed in with the glass, like cruel little teeth, were small, curved fishing hooks, the kind the boys used when they went down to the creek with Mark. They were pressed upright into the sheet, barely breaking the fabric, waiting for weight. My stomach rolled. I didn't scream. The sound caught somewhere behind my ribs. Instead, I stood there, frozen, listening to the house breathe around me, the hum of the fridge downstairs, Rusty's muffled bark from the yard, a car far off on the road. My eyes slid to the doorway. Just beyond the frame, down the hall, the shadows were thick, and I had the sudden, dizzy certainty that someone was standing just out of sight, holding their breath. It took me a long minute to move. When I did, I went into this strange, focused calm. I backed away, turned on the overhead light, and very carefully began to strip the bed, shaking the glass and hooks into an old pillowcase I found in the dresser. My hands trembled so badly I could barely knot it closed. I told myself it could have been an accident, that maybe a jar had broken in the laundry and somehow ended up here, but there was no way. The hooks were pushed in deliberately, spaced just far enough apart that lying down would have driven them deep. I thought of the narrowness in Caleb's eyes when I reminded him to pick up his things. The flat way Head said, "You're not my mom," like it was a threat, not a fact. I thought of the way he liked to stand at the bottom of the stairs and listen. I didn't tell Denise and Mark. Even now, years later, that's the part that still embarrasses me. I was the outsider, the girl from out of state who'd never driven a mountain road in winter. And I didn't want to be the dramatic one who came running downstairs accusing their quiet 9-year-old of something that sounded insane. I told myself I'd overreacted, that it was enough just to be careful from now on, to lock my door at night and keep my eyes open. So I remade the bed, threw the pillowcase of glass and hooks into the dumpster behind the shed, and tried to sleep with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The second incident came a few weeks later, on a gray Saturday that smelled like rain. Denise was at the hospital, Mark was fixing something on the truck, and the boys were supposed to be playing in the yard. Eli had a friend from down the road over, and their shouts drifted up and down the driveway. When I couldn't see Caleb from the porch, I assumed he was with them until Eli came up to ask for a snack, and when I asked where his brother was, shrugged and said Head gone back in the trees. The forest that cradled the hollow had always made me nervous. Locals warned me about copperheads and old mine shafts, about losing cell service if I went too far. The trees grew close together, And even in the middle of the day, the light back there felt dim and layered, like water. I followed the narrow deer path behind the house, calling Caleb's name in what I hoped was an even tone, listening for the rustle of feet or the crack of a branch. The air cooled sharply as I went down, and a sweet, sick smell crept into it, faint but growing stronger. At first, I thought it was just something dead in the underbrush a raccoon hit on the road. Maybe, but the odor seemed concentrated up ahead where the ground leveled out in a small clearing. That's when I saw it. Someone had arranged a circle of stones in the center of the clearing, careful and symmetrical, each one about the size of my fist. Inside the circle, the earth had been scraped bare, clawed down to wet dirt. There were bones there, cleaned white in some places and still smeared with gristle in others, small skulls I didn't want to identify, little clumps of fur and feather. They weren't just scattered. They were placed, sorted into piles, aligned like diagrams in a book. Propped against one of the stones was Rusty's missing collar, the worn red nylon scraped and darkened. For a moment, everything inside me went cold. Rusty had been gone 3 days. Mark kept saying he'd come back, that dogs sometimes wandered into town and found their way home with the smell of bacon. Wed put up a flyer at the gas station. Denise had cried into a dish towel when she thought no one was looking. Around the edge of the stone circle, jars were half buried in the dirt, their glass cloudy with moisture. My hands shook as I dug one out and held it up. Inside, floating in a shallow layer of something cloudy and yellow, was a little cluster of objects that made my stomach twist. A silver stud earring. I'd lost my first week there, the one with a tiny star on it. A button I recognized from the cardigan I wore almost every morning, a thin twist of hair that was my color, tied with red thread. I almost dropped the jar. It landed back in the dirt with a dull thud. Behind me, a twig snapped. I spun around, heart hammering, and there was Caleb, standing at the edge of the clearing, his sneakers muddy, hands in the pockets of his hoodie. He watched me, his expression unreadable, eyes flicking from my face to the jar in my hand and back again. For a long second, neither of us spoke. Then Ellis' voice echoed faintly from higher up the hill, calling for his brother, and the spell broke. Caleb turned and walked back toward the house, unhurried, as if wed simply passed each other on the stairs. That night, after the boys were asleep, I told Denise and Mark everything. I left out the glass on the bed, but described the clearing, the bones, the jars, the things of mine mixed in with whatever else Head decided to keep. Denise went pale, then angry, insisting that mountain kids grew up hunting and trapping, that Eli had skinned his first squirrel at 10. I tried to explain that this was different, that what I'd seen wasn't normal curiosity or rough play. But the more I talked, the more defensive they became. Mark said Head had to haul off dead animals his own dog had dragged home when he was Caleb's age, that it didn't mean anything, and that if I'd found some weird little fort the boys were building, I should have just told them to clean it up. When they finally called Caleb into the kitchen, all I could see was the jar in my hand and his face in the clearing, blank and still. He stood in the doorway, shoulders slumped, and shook his head when his parents asked about it, voice suddenly small and trembly as he said he didn't know what I was talking about. He even glanced over at me with eyes that looked wet and wounded, as if I'd accused him of something terrible out of nowhere. In that moment, I realized there was no way I was going to win. They'd known him his whole life. I was just the girl who'd been there 6 weeks. After that, something shifted in the house. On the surface, everything went back to normal. The school mornings, the dinners, the laundry. But there was a tension under it, a tautness in the air. I caught Denise watching me sometimes with a new kind of measuring look, as if she were wondering whether I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too unstable for mountain life. Caleb, on the other hand, seemed lighter. He hummed to himself more, started drawing at the kitchen table with a focus that almost looked healthy, until I noticed the colors he chose. Blacks and reds and dark greens, rough pencil sketches of the house from odd angles, the outline of a figure standing in the upstairs window. And even when he wasn't in the room, I felt him close, like a pressure at the back of my neck. By November, the trees had thinned, their branches bare against a sky that was more gray than blue. The wind funneled up through the hollow and made the old farmhouse shudder. That was when the third and worst thing happened. Mark was working nights again. Denise picked up an extra shift to cover holiday expenses, and the boys were home with me. Eli fell asleep on the couch, watching a movie. Caleb read in his room, door partly open. The power blinked once around 10, then settled. I went to bed around 11, made sure my door was locked, phone charging on the nightstand. Sleep came harder now. My body stayed tense, even when my mind started to drift. Sometime after midnight, I jolted awake with the conviction that someone had said my name. The room was quiet. The only sound was the low whir of the space heater in the corner and the wind pressing at the window. For a moment, I thought it was just a dream. Then I caught it. A soft, irregular, rasping sound. Close enough that it felt like it was inside my head. It took a second to place it as breathing. When my eyes adjusted, I saw a darker shape at the side of my bed, just where the circle of light from my lamp faded. It was small but upright. My throat closed, but instead of screaming, I lay perfectly still, my hand inching toward the lamp. When my fingertips brushed the switch and the room flooded with warm light, the shape resolved into Caleb. He was standing less than a foot from my mattress, eyes wide and perfectly calm, as if I were the one who'd done something strange. In his right hand, angled down toward the floor, was one of Mark's hunting knives, the long one he kept in a locked cabinet in the mudroom. In his left hand, dangling by its strap, was a cheap instant camera, the kind that spits out little square photographs that you shake dry. One of those squares lay on the floor near his socked feet, face down. We stared at each other for what felt like a full minute. The knife gleamed once in the lamplight. I couldn't move. My brain, in those seconds, did something oddly practical. It took stock of how far I was from the door, whether the window would open fast enough, whether Eli was close enough to hear if I shouted. Then my voice came back all at once and I screamed, hoarse and raw. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. Caleb didn't flinch. He set the knife down with exaggerated care on my nightstand, like he was placing a spoon on a table, and stepped back. By the time Denise burst into the room, face pale and hair wild, he was rubbing his eyes with his fists, mumbling that Head had a bad dream and didn't know how Head gotten there. When I pointed at the knife, the words tumbling out of me in broken pieces. Mark, who had come straight from the driveway still smelling of engine oil, picked it up, frowning, and demanded to know how it had left the cabinet. Caleb only shrugged, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, shoulders hunched inside his too big pajama shirt. Denise turned her gaze on me, tired and wary, and asked, carefully, if I was sure I hadn't left the door unlocked. If I was absolutely certain I hadn't imagined him standing there. If maybe I'd heard about his sleepwalking and let my mind run away with me. I wanted to drag them all to the clearing in the woods, to make them touch the jars, to show them the way the glass had sliced my hand, to force them to look at their son the way I saw him in that moment, calm and collected with a knife in his hand beside my bed. But I was shaking so hard that the words came out as a mess, high and panicked, and I watched the last of their beliefs slip. When they sent Caleb back to his room, I saw his expression change for just a heartbeat as he turned away, the corners of his mouth flattening, eyes going cool and distant. On his way out, his heel brushed that little square photograph on the floor, flipping it over. After everyone left, and I was alone again, I picked it up with numb fingers. The picture was grainy and a little overexposed, but there was no mistaking what it showed. Me, asleep in my bed, mouth slightly open, one arm flung above my head. The angle suggested it had been taken from the doorway, from the very spot where he liked to stand and watch. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat with my back against the headboard, the photograph on the nightstand, the lamp blazing until dawn. I made coffee before Denise woke and waited at the kitchen table, my packed duffel at my feet. I was ready to tell them I couldn't stay, that something was deeply wrong here, that they could keep my last paycheck. I expected anger and arguments. I didn't expect what actually happened. Denise came down alone, face set. She didn't sit. Instead, She told me in a careful, brittle voice that Shed found her mother's locket, the one she kept in a jewelry box in her bedroom, in the front pocket of my duffel when Shed gone to get something the night before. I hadn't seen her go into my room, hadn't heard the door open over the gale of my own pulse, but in that instant I knew exactly how the locket had gotten there, just as clearly as I knew who had poured glass on my sheets and arranged bones in the forest. I denied it, of course, the words spilling out, desperate and hot. I swore I'd never touched her things, begged her to consider what he'd told them about Caleb, about the clearing and the knife and the picture. She listened without interrupting, jaw tight, then told me they'd already called the agency and asked for a replacement, that it would be better for everyone if I left by the afternoon. The hurt in her voice wasn't theatrical. I think part of her really believed I'd betrayed her. Part of her was probably relieved to have a simpler villain than the boy sleeping down the hall. I didn't show her the photograph. I don't fully know why. Maybe some stubborn part of me thought it wouldn't matter, that Shed find a way to explain it away, that in this house, in this hollow, the truth could twist into whatever shape people needed it to be. Mark drove me down the mountain in near silence. When we reached the gas station at the intersection where the valley met the highway, he set my duffel on the pavement and pressed a folded envelope with my remaining pay into my hand. He didn't quite meet my eyes. "It's different up here," he said finally, as if that explained anything, and then he left, tires spitting gravel as he turned back toward Willow Gap. It's been years since then. I live in a city now, in an apartment where the closest thing to a forest is the park 2 blocks over, and the only animals I see regularly are squirrels fat on leftover fries. I work in an office, with bright lights and HR policies and people who make small talk about television shows. On paper, my life is ordinary and safe. But there are nights when a train whistles somewhere beyond my window, and just for a second, I'm back in that narrow bed under the sloped roof, listening to branches scrape the siding and wondering if the house is the thing that's breathing or if it's something else. Sometimes I dream that I'm walking through those woods behind the Harper place, pushed along by a wind I can't feel. And I know before I get there that the clearing will be waiting. Stones in their perfect circle, jars in the dirt. Something new added to the collection. I wake up with my heart pounding and have to check my bedroom door twice to make sure it's locked. I don't know where Caleb is now. By my count, he'd be in his late teens, maybe finishing high school, maybe working nights at that same gas station where I stood with my duffel and my misplaced locket. Maybe he moved away. Maybe he never left. What I do know is that every report I see about someone who started with animals and moved on to people makes my stomach twist in a familiar way. I wonder if his parents ever walked into the woods behind their house and really looked at what he left there. I wonder if they still tell themselves it was just a phase. I've never gone back to Willow Gap, and I don't plan to. But the mountains still follow me in this quiet, persistent way. They live in the corners of my memory like a road sign I pass too fast to read. And even now, after all this time, I sometimes catch myself rehearsing the story in my head, turning it over, wondering if there was a moment when I could have done something different, said something that would have made them truly listen. Maybe that's why I'm finally writing it down. If you've ever worked with kids, or grown up in a place like that, or seen a kind of darkness in someone so young that it made you question your own instincts, I honestly want to know what you think. Would you have believed me or him? Story 2. Traveling alone was never what scared me. If anything, it made me feel most like myself. I grew up in a tiny coastal town in Norway where the winters felt endless, and everyone knew what your parents did for a living, what time you took the bus, who you'd kissed behind the supermarket. I used to dream about slipping out of that snow-glazed world and landing somewhere completely different, somewhere green and unfamiliar where no one knew my name. By the time I turned 23, I'd saved enough to do something about it. I'd always been good with kids and fascinated by the way they think, the way their fears and joys grow into the adults they become. So becoming a live-in nanny felt like the perfect bridge between travel and the future I wanted. I signed up with an agency and somehow ended up in the Appalachian Mountains, with a host family in a little town outside a college city in eastern Tennessee. The first time I rode up into the hills with my host mom, my ears popped as the road wound tighter, and the air felt different from home, warmer, but with the same sense that nature was bigger than you. Their house sat on a ridge above a narrow valley, all dark wood and deep porch, the forest pressing in around the backyard like a tidal wave of oak and pine. Loneliness wasn't really an issue. The agency connected me with other au pairs, and I latched onto a small group right away. My closest friend was an American girl named Maya, sharp and funny and a little reckless, who worked part-time at a coffee shop in town and part-time for a family up another ridge. We were both there for the same reasons: to work just enough, to explore as much as we could, and to collect memories that felt bigger than anything we'd left behind. The college down in the valley was the center of everything: bars, cheap restaurants, noisy house parties. Almost every Tuesday night, Maya and I would drive down the mountain in her squeaky car for trivia and tacos at a bar called the Copper Still, which was one of the few places you could drink something that wasn't light beer and not run into half your host mom's co-workers. Tuesdays became our ritual, this bright little pin in the week to look forward to. That's where I met him. I was leaning against the bar, waiting for our drinks, half listening to the trivia host's voice through the speakers, when a tall guy with messy dark curls stepped into the space beside me and asked, almost casually, if I was from Scandinavia. It took me a second to process the question because most people just guessed Europe and left it at that. When I told him yes, he smiled like he'd gotten something right on a test he hadn't studied for, and said he'd spent a semester abroad in Sweden and recognized the accent. His name was Luke. He was a grad student at the university, studying something to do with environmental planning, and he had that easy, practiced confidence of someone who's used to being listened to. I get approached a lot when I go out. I know I'm pretty, and the combination of an accent and being foreign seems to be catnip in college towns, but most guys quickly reveal themselves with clumsy jokes and lazy questions. Luke wasn't like that, at least not on the surface. He didn't just ask where I was from. He knew the names of Scandinavian bands I loved, had opinions about Norwegian thrillers, and asked thoughtful questions about what it was like growing up somewhere with so much darkness in winter. That first night, we talked long enough that Maya had to come rescue our drinks from the bar and give me a look that said, "Who is this and why is he still here?" But even she admitted later that he didn't seem like the usual type who wanted a story about hooking up with a girl from somewhere else. Before he left, he asked for my number in a way that didn't feel pushy, just expectant, like he already knew I'd say yes. I did. At first, everything unfolded the way new crushes are supposed to. He texted a few days later and invited me over for dinner at the house he rented with 2 other grad students halfway down the mountain. I went, expecting we'd end up grabbing takeout, but when I walked into the kitchen, he was actually cooking. Sleeves pushed up, a pot of something simmering on the stove. He'd picked a dish he said he'd learned from an old roommate in Stockholm, and the effort was disarming in a way that made me drop my guard. He'd bought a bottle of wine and lit a candle in the middle of the scratched dining table, and we ate and talked late into the night. His roommates were conveniently at the library, which I didn't think much about then. For a girl who had flown across an ocean to be here, it felt like the sort of night you imagine when you sign the contract and imagine your life in a new country. I ended up staying over. More because it felt easier to sleep on his surprisingly clean bed than to drive switchbacks in the dark. It was the next morning, wandering around his room while he took a shower, that I noticed the photos. One entire wall above his desk was covered in small square prints, all in black and white. At first glance, they were just pretty landscapes, mountains, coastlines, little pockets of dense forest. But there was something familiar about them that tugged at me. I stepped closer and saw the captions, printed in tiny letters underneath. Place names from home: Bergen, Tromsø. The island I'd spent summers on as a kid, same shape, same curve of coastline, same sharp line of mountains behind it. My stomach did a slow somersault. Finally, in the upper corner, there was a shot taken from high above a string of red-roofed houses along a fjord, and I recognized it instantly. It was my hometown, or at least the town 20 minutes away that everyone used as a reference point because our village was too small to be on most maps. It was almost exactly the angle of a photo I'd posted on Instagram when I was 18, down to the boats in the harbor. When he came back into the room, towel around his shoulders, and saw me staring, He just laughed and said his dad collected aerial photography and had picked his favorites. He called it a crazy coincidence that one of them happened to be near where I grew up and asked a few questions about my family, my school, my life before Appalachia. I wanted to feel flattered, like fate had threaded our stories together in some romantic way, but something icy had settled under my ribs. Back then, it just felt like a weird detail I didn't know what to do with, so I stored it away and moved on. Over the next few weeks, Luke and I fell into a pattern. I worked long days with my host kids, 2 little boys with nonstop energy and a baby girl who hated naps, and he had class and labs, but on weekends and Tuesday nights he would slide into my life like he'd always been there. He was attentive in all the right ways, remembering small things I said, asking if Maya wanted to bring whoever she was seeing so it wouldn't feel like a date-only thing, insisting on driving me back up the mountain so I wasn't alone on the dark hairpin road. That caring side was part of why I brushed off the first real red flag. The first horror element came small, almost disguised as something sweet. One Tuesday, a few of us went down to the Copper Still after trivia, and the place was more crowded than usual. We had to park in the gravel lot behind the bar, right next to the alley where the dumpsters were. When we came out hours later, the lights from the back door made everything look washed out and grainy. Maya and her guy headed to their car, and Luke walked me to mine. It was only when I unlocked the door that I noticed the white scrap tucked under my wiper blade. At first I thought it was a flyer, but when I unfolded it, a cold shiver ran through me. It was a printed photo on regular paper, slightly pixelated, of me and the youngest kid I looked after, taken from across the street as we played in the front yard of my host family's house. The date stamp in the corner was from 3 days earlier. On the back, in neat writing, were the words, "You look happiest here." There was no logo, no number, nothing else. Just that. I remember my mouth going dry. I showed it to Luke, my voice too loud and too fast, babbling that it was creepy, that someone must have driven up the ridge to take it, that maybe my host mom's ex had done it or some random hunter. He studied it for a second, his face unreadable, then crumpled it up and told me it was probably some dumb college kid with a new zoom lens and no boundaries, that small towns make people weird, and I shouldn't take it so seriously. Hez, the one who tossed it into the trash can by the door, I let him. Later, I told myself that crumpled photo was my first real chance to trust my instincts, and I blew right past it because I didn't want to be the paranoid foreign girl who overreacts to everything. The second horror moment was messier and harder to rationalize. A couple of weeks after that, Luke invited me over on a Sunday, saying his roommates were gone and he wanted to cook for me again. It was raining that afternoon, the kind of steady Appalachian rain that turns dirt roads to slick red mud and makes the clouds sit low on the hills. By the time I made it to his place, my hair was damp and my shoes were splattered. Dinner was fine, the wine was better. At some point, I went to take a shower, grateful to wash off the sticky feeling from a long week. When I stepped out, the mirror above the sink was fogged with steam, my reflection a soft blur. I wiped a circle clear with my palm and froze. There, written in the condensation above my shoulder where my face should have been, were the words, "I liked you better with bangs like in 2019. My stomach dropped through the floor. I hadn't had bangs since I was 19. The only place those photos existed now was buried deep in my Instagram feed, long before my move, before I'd even thought about America. I hadn't mentioned them aloud. The message was still beating, droplets sliding down the letters. Whoever had written it had done it recently enough that the mirror hadn't had time to clear. There were no windows in that bathroom. No way some stranger had slipped in. I stood there in my towel, dripping onto the bath mat, suddenly acutely aware of how trapped I was. A windowless room, a closed door, another door beyond that, his footsteps somewhere in the house. I scrubbed the words away until the mirror squeaked, my heartbeat roaring in my ears, then forced myself to walk back into the bedroom like nothing had happened. I didn't ask him about it. I couldn't, because if it wasn't him, then the situation was somehow even worse. The third horror element came the night I finally stopped making excuses for him. We'd gone out with friends, had a few drinks, and ended up back at his place. He was drunker than usual, his easy charm frayed at the edges. And on the walk from the car to the house, he started talking in this loose, unfiltered way about how much he loved foreign girls. How Head always pictured marrying someone from over there because you're all better with kids and not as jaded. He said it like a compliment, but it made my skin crawl. Later, when he passed out half-dressed on the bed, the glow of his phone lighting up his face as notifications came in, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, replaying the mirror, the photo under my wiper, the wall of landscapes that looked too much like my life. My phone was on the bedside table next to his. His buzzed again, and before I could talk myself out of it, I picked it up. He hadn't even bothered to put in a complex passcode. It was the same 4-digit string Head typed in front of me a dozen times. I told myself I was only going to look for proof that I was being crazy, that I'd find normal things, group chats, class emails, memes, and feel stupid and relieved. Instead, I opened the photo gallery and my blood ran cold. There was an album named Future with a ring emoji next to it. Inside were screenshots of my social media going back months, maybe years old. Photos from before I'd left Norway, pictures with my siblings, posts tagged in places near my parents' house, captions I barely remembered writing. There were zoomed-in images of my face, cropped from group photos. Me laughing, me looking away, me holding somebody's baby cousin at a family party. Mixed in with those were photos that made my vision swim. A picture of my driver's license that I'd lost at a party my second week in Tennessee. The light from a porch lamp reflecting in the plastic. A blurry shot of me unlocking the door to my host family's house taken from across the street. 2 grainy night photos of the cabin where the family sometimes went for weekends. Recognizable only because of the carved bear statue on the porch. In another folder, simply named Notes, were screenshots of my Instagram stories, annotated with dates and times, as if He'd been building a schedule from them when I usually went for a run up the mountain road, where Maya and I parked in town on certain nights, what time my host mom left for work. There were entire paragraphs in his phone's notes app where He'd translated old Norwegian captions into English, adding comments about what they revealed about me. Near the bottom was something else. A scanned image that took me a moment to process. An envelope from my parents with my full name and the address of my childhood home printed in their neat handwriting. Above it, He'd written, "Still there?" My throat tightened so much it hurt. This wasn't a crush, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a project, carefully curated over time, and I was the project. Then I found the last thing. A series of photos clearly taken through the window of my bedroom at the host family's house. In one, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting toys. In another, I was stretching, mid-yawn, in an oversized t-shirt. In the final one, I was asleep, hair across my face, hand resting near my throat. The timestamp on that last one was from a week earlier, on a night I distinctly remembered going to bed early, feeling proud of myself for skipping a night out to catch up on sleep. The realization hit hard. He had driven up the ridge, parked somewhere on that dark, narrow road, and stood outside my window with his phone pressed to the glass while I slept less than a meter away. The house was isolated enough that our nearest neighbor wouldn't have seen a thing. I put the phone down carefully, fingers numb, and understood in a way that made me feel sick that there was nothing accidental about any of this, nothing romantic or fated. He hadn't stumbled into my life at a bar, had found my lost wallet, my ID, and used it as a road map. Had studied me long before I ever heard his name. The room suddenly felt smaller. I grabbed my things as quietly as I could, the jeans draped over a chair, my phone, my bag near the door. I didn't take screenshots, didn't think to snap photos for proof. In that moment, the only thing my brain cared about was getting distance between my body and that room, that house, that wall of carefully curated evidence that I hadn't consented to be part of. I slipped out the front door, heart hammering, and nearly sprinted to my car. The drive back up the mountain is a blur in my memory, just rain streaking the windshield, my hands shaking on the wheel, every pair of headlights behind me making my chest tighten with fear that it was him already awake and following. When I got home, I locked every door and checked the kids twice, just to reassure myself that they were breathing, warm, unharmed. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages. Luke asking where I'd gone, if everything was okay, if Head done something wrong, if I'd gone through his phone. The shame of that detail of being the one who had snooped made it harder to respond. But when I finally did, the words came out harder than I expected. I told him I knew what he'd been doing, that it was over, that if he contacted me again, I'd go to the police. Then I blocked his number, his Instagram, every account I had for him. For a few days, there was silence, and I let myself believe that maybe this was one of those awful but closed chapters I could stash on a shelf in my mind and never touch again. I locked down my social media, removed geotags, stopped posting publicly. I started taking different routes up and down the mountain, parking in different spots, never leaving the kids to play in the front yard alone. The valley that had felt like freedom when I first arrived now felt like a bowl I couldn't climb out of, with eyes on the rim watching. Then came the final, lingering horror that still curls in my stomach when I think about it. It started with small things. A new account with no profile picture. Watching every story the second I posted it. Text messages from random numbers that said things like, "Can we talk?" and "I'm sorry," without a name attached. One afternoon, driving back from town just before sunset, I noticed a silver sedan in my rearview mirror halfway up the ridge road. At first, it was just another car, but as the switchbacks tightened and the trees closed in, it stayed right with me, slowing when I slowed, speeding up when I did. I pulled off at a little gravel overlook halfway up under the pretense of taking a photo of the view, just to see what they'd do. The silver car rolled past slowly, the driver's face hidden behind the reflection off the windshield, then pulled over just a little farther up the road and sat there, engine idling. I remember the way the hair on my arms lifted, despite the humidity. I turned around and drove back down instead of continuing home, parking in the lot of a crowded grocery store until my heart rate came down. Over the next couple of weeks, I saw that same car enough times that I started to recognize the dents on the passenger side. Parked at the entrance to the road that led to my host family's house. Sitting in the far corner of the lot behind the copper still. Crawling slowly past me on a residential street near the playground. Always far enough away that I couldn't get a clear view of the driver without walking toward it, which I never had the courage to do. I started keeping a list. Dates, times, plate numbers. I thought he'd memorized, but later realized my brain had scrambled with panic. Eventually, I sat at the kitchen table with my notes in front of me. The kids' crayon marks ghosted into the wood, and realized I had to do something more than just be afraid. I called a non-emergency police line, hands shaking, and tried to explain that a guy I'd gone out with had essentially been tracking me for months. That Head had detailed photos, that he might be the one driving past my house at all hours. The officer on the phone was polite but distant, telling me that unless Head explicitly threatened me or trespassed on camera, there wasn't much they could do beyond taking a report. I gave them his name anyway. I gave them mine. I hung up feeling both exposed and weirdly invisible, like I'd shouted into a canyon and only heard a faint echo back. My au pair contract was ending in a few weeks. Friends back home told me to ride it out and come back to Norway, to breathe air that didn't taste like fear every time a car slowed behind me. Maya was furious on my behalf, offering to drive past his house with me, to confront him, to post screenshots, and blast his name to everyone we knew. But I was too tired and too scared of making him angrier. In the end, I finished my contract, hugged my host kids goodbye with a calmness I didn't feel, and flew home with my suitcase heavier than when it arrived and my sense of safety lighter by half. It's been a while now. I'm back in Europe, working toward my degree, surrounded by people who don't know about the wall of photos or the way my reflection looked in that fogged-up mirror. The mountains here are different, softer, but there are still nights when a car slows outside my apartment, and my whole body goes rigid until I hear it drive away. I still check the windows before I sleep. I still flinch a little when a stranger knows just one too many details about where I'm from. Writing this down is my way of putting a frame around it, of saying, this happened and it wasn't okay. And also of asking something from whoever's listening. If you've ever had someone cross those invisible lines, if you've brushed off the feeling that someone knew too much about you until it was almost too late, What would you have done in my place? Would you have gone to the police sooner? Told your host family? Confronted him directly? I'm genuinely curious how it sounds from the outside. So, if you're comfortable sharing, tell me in the comments what you think you would have done, or even what you wish someone had done for you. Story 3. This happened a few years ago, but there are still nights when I wake up with the taste of that day in my mouth, like metal and exhaust and damp air from the mountains pressing in. I'd always wanted to live near the Appalachians, ever since I was a kid in flat, gray Ontario watching nature documentaries about misty ridgelines and tiny towns tucked into green valleys. It felt like another world, wild, insular, a place where life moved slower and people knew their neighbors. More than anything, though, I wanted to work with kids. I was that teenager who always volunteered in the church nursery, who babysat for half the neighborhood, who felt more comfortable reading to a circle of preschoolers than making small talk with people my own age. I knew I wouldn't be happy in a life that didn't involve caring for or teaching children in some way. So when I realized I could combine those two things, working with kids and living in the mountains, it felt like the universe finally nudging me in a clear direction. A friend had mentioned live-in nanny and au pair style positions in the U.S., families who offered room and board and a small stipend in exchange for childcare. I spent weeks scrolling through listings, narrowing my search to Appalachian states, Tennessee, North Carolina, West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky. The photos all blurred together after a while. Log cabins with rocking chairs on porches, ranch houses with swing sets and above-ground pools, farmhouses with yards that bled into forest. Money was a real problem. I was on my own. For a lot of reasons I won't unpack here, relying on my family wasn't an option. The reputable agencies that vetted families and handled visas were expensive, their fees more than I had in my savings account. So, I did what I could manage. I used a free caregiver website, the kind filled with grainy photos, long descriptions of looking for someone who will become part of our family, and little flags next to first names instead of last names. That's where I found Evelyn. Her profile caught me because it sounded specific but not crazy. 2 kids, 7 and 9, both in school most of the day. A husband who traveled for work. A farmhouse outside a town in eastern Kentucky I'd never heard of. Somewhere in the foothills, about an hour from the nearest city. Her writing was warm but tidy. She said she needed help with after-school care, meal prep, and light housework. And she mentioned her kids by name, Lily and Jonah, and what they liked. She said they loved reading, hikes, and baking, and she wanted someone who'd be okay with the peaceful quiet of mountain life. Quiet sounded like exactly what I needed. We moved to video calls. On screen, she looked like every overworked mom I'd ever known. Late 30s, shoulder-length brown hair, a slightly tired smile that sharpened when she talked about the kids. She had that soft southern cadence, but not so strong that I struggled to understand her. She asked thoughtful questions about my experience with children, what I did when a kid was scared or stubborn, how I felt about living far from a big city. She called me sweetheart and hon in a way that felt different from home, but more motherly than creepy. She seemed genuinely interested in who I was, not just what I could do. There was one thing that stuck in my mind even then, like a tiny splinter I couldn't quite pull out. She never let me see the kids. I asked several times if I could say hi to them during our calls. The first time, she said they were at a neighbor's house for a play date. The second time, they were up the road with their grandma. Another time, she said they were already asleep because school came early. Once, as we were talking, I thought I heard a child's voice in the background, a fast, high-pitched laugh. But when I asked if that was Lily, her face tightened for a second before she smiled and said it was the TV in the next room. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Of course, I'd meet them as soon as I arrived. She sent me a written agreement that looked professional enough. Hours, stipend, room and private bathroom and family home, a vague mention of respectful house rules. We agreed that I'd stay for at least 10 months, maybe longer if it worked out. I booked my bus ticket. They didn't live near a major airport, and flying was out of my budget anyway. Packed my life into one big suitcase and a backpack, and said goodbye to Canada at a gray, anonymous terminal that smelled like coffee and bleach. The bus ride south took more than a day. I slept in fragments, head bouncing against the window, waking up in different cities whose names blurred together. Somewhere in Ohio, the flat landscape began to wrinkle, turning into hills, then full-on mountains. By the time we rolled into the small Appalachian city where I was supposed to meet Evelyn, my legs were stiff and my brain felt like cotton. The terminal was smaller than I expected. Just a low building with a few bays, a convenience store, and a row of plastic chairs where tired people stared at their phones. Evelyn had promised to pick me up right there. "He'll be the one waving like a fool," she had written, adding a laughing emoji that had made me smile at the time. But when I stepped off the bus with my suitcase bumping behind me, there was no one waving, foolish or otherwise. I checked the time. I was 10 minutes early. No big deal. I sat down on a cracked bench outside and watched cars pull in and out of the drop-off lane. Families reunited with hugs that made my chest ache a little. One guy in a reflective vest swept the sidewalk in slow, bored arcs. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Evelyn. Traffic on the highway was backed up for miles because of an accident, she wrote. She was so sorry, but Shed sent her cousin Tessa to get me instead. She's in a silver SUV, should be there any minute. She knows exactly who you are. Just go out by the far end of the sidewalk where the taxis pull in, less crowded there. You'll be safe with her. Can't wait to hug you when you get here. I read it twice. A small warning bell went off in my mind. I'd used my phone's offline maps to save the address Shed given me, and Wed talked about what car she drove, a blue pickup, not a silver SUV. The idea of a stranger picking me up didn't feel great, but everything in me was tired and eager to get this part of the journey over with. This was my new life starting, I told myself. Don't sabotage it because you're nervous. I hauled my suitcase down toward the far end of the drop-off zone, where it was quieter. There's a detail from that moment that I've never been able to shake. One of those little horror movie freeze frames that my brain revisits when I'm not careful. As I walked away from the cluster of people near the main doors, I noticed a young woman sitting alone on a bench farther down, maybe my age, maybe a little younger, clutching a duffel against her chest. She had that same focused on her phone posture I probably did. But when I glanced at her screen, I saw a message thread open with a name and a little heart emoji, and the last text said, "I'm here. Where are you?" With no reply. Our eyes met for half a second. There was something brittle and panicked in her expression, like she was trying very hard not to show how scared she was. Before either of us could say anything, a dark sedan pulled up and parked right in front of her. A man stepped out, mid-40s, baseball cap low on his forehead, mouth fixed in a non-smile. He said something I didn't catch. She hesitated for a breath, then stood and walked toward the car. I looked away, because it felt rude to watch. By the time I glanced back a few seconds later, the car was already pulling into traffic. My phone buzzed again. She should be right there now, Evelyn had written. Silver SUV, blonde hair, big smile. You can't miss her. The timing made my skin prickle, though I couldn't have told you why exactly. A silver SUV did in fact pull up a moment later. The woman who got out looked like Shed, stepped straight out of a catalog for warm southern relatives. Late 40s, short blonde hair, pastel cardigan over a floral blouse, a wide, practiced smile. She walked toward me with an arm slightly extended, like she was about to go in for a hug but thought better of it. "You must be our girl," she said, my real name rolling off her tongue without hesitation. She introduced herself as Tessa, said Evelyn was fit to be tied about the traffic, and couldn't wait to meet you at the house. Her voice was bright but efficient, like Shed rehearsed this. I asked if I could call Evelyn quickly, just to hear her voice. She laughed it off at first, saying the service on the highway was spotty and she was probably stuck somewhere on the shoulder trying not to burn through her gas. But I lifted my phone anyway and hit the call button. The line went straight to voicemail. No ring, just that canned message I'd heard before. "See?" Tessa said, shrugging. "Told you. Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you out of this heat." It was early fall, but the air down in the valley felt heavy, pressing against my skin. I was exhausted, more than a little overwhelmed, and some stubborn part of me didn't want to be the difficult girl who refused help before Shed even arrived. So I did what she said. I loaded my suitcase into the back of the SUV and climbed into the passenger seat. The second horror detail hit almost as soon as I closed the door. The interior of the car smelled wrong. Not just like old fast food or perfume, but like some mix of industrial cleaner and something metallic underneath. A faint rust and sour scent that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The dashboard was clutter-free, the seats clean. But when I glanced into the back, my stomach twisted. There were 2 car seat anchors bolted into the back bench, but no actual seats, just the impressions where they'd been. The fabric around the anchor points was deeply stained in places, darker than the rest, like something had spilled there and never really come out. On the inside of the rear door, just above the handle, the plastic was scored with uneven marks, deep scratches, some almost parallel, others chaotic. For a moment I told myself they could have been from a dog, but the spacing was wrong, too tight together, like someone had dragged their nails there over and over. I snapped my gaze forward and clicked my seatbelt, feeling suddenly like a prop in someone else's story. We pulled away from the terminal. At first, the route matched what Id saved on my map. A stretch of highway with billboards for fireworks and chain restaurants. Then an exit that led toward the foothills. My phone's data was patchy, but the blue dot on my screen stayed close to the line for a while. Tessa kept up a steady stream of chatter, asking about my trip, how long he'd wanted to come to the States, if I was a mountain person or a beach person. When I steered the conversation toward the kids, asking about Lily's favorite books or what grade Jonah was in, she answered quickly, but in broad strokes that any stranger could have guessed. She just loves anything with animals in it. Hessall boy. You know how that is. And then immediately guided us back to safer, more generic topics. The hills grew steeper. We passed gas stations and small clusters of houses, then fewer houses, then just trees pressing in on both sides. I watched the map on my phone as long as I had service. When we took a turn that veered off the route, Id saved the dot jumped, then disappeared altogether as the signal dropped. I told myself there might be multiple ways to get there, that maybe she knew a back road around the supposed traffic. But the farther we went, the more the landscape shifted from rural to no one would hear you scream out here. Crumbling barns, rusted trailers half swallowed by kudzu, a long chain-link fence topped with barbed wire around what looked like an abandoned processing plant, its windows dark and gaping. That was my second horror element in full. The realization that the world outside the window had quietly turned into somewhere no one would think twice about seeing a lone SUV heading nowhere in particular. I asked, trying to sound casual, how much longer it would be. She gave a vague answer. Something about just a bit further up the road. My palms were slick on my knees. I took a breath and said, in a steadier voice than I felt, that I wanted to go back to the bus station, that maybe we should wait there for Evelyn. The smile on her face tightened just a fraction, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. She told me I was tired, that it was normal to feel jittery after a long trip, that I'd feel better once I'd had a shower and a proper meal. She didn't slow down. I tried again. I said I was getting carsick, that I needed a restroom, that my mom was expecting a photo of me in front of the house when I got there. That last part was true. I had promised my mom I'd send a picture as soon as I arrived. I glanced at my phone. No service. No way to send my location. The car kept going, deeper into the maze of narrow roads and hollows that my map hadn't fully loaded. My heart was beating so hard it felt like a physical object lodged in my throat. The third horror moment came when the car finally slowed. Not in front of a farmhouse with a wraparound porch and kids spilling out the door, but at a lonely three-way intersection surrounded by trees and an empty field. There were no other cars, no houses, just a bent road sign, a sagging billboard for some long-closed diner, and a single trash can half tipped over in the ditch. For a second, I thought she was going to turn. Instead, she put the car in park and turned toward me, her hands still resting lightly on the steering wheel. Up close, without the constant movement, I could see the fine lines at the corners of her mouth that didn't match the ones at the corners of her eyes, as if she smiled a lot but almost never for real. I can't repeat her exact words because my brain was trying so hard to catalog everything at once, but the gist was simple. I needed to calm down. We were almost there. She understood that I was nervous, but I was in good hands. When I reached for my door handle, it didn't budge. My breath trapped in my chest. She must have seen the panic flash across my face, because she laughed, a sound that didn't touch her eyes, and leaned over to hit the button to unlock it. "Child locks," she said lightly. "Forgot those were on. Can't have the little ones jumping out, you know." The way she said little ones made something inside me go ice cold. With my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear, I did something I'm still not sure I would have had the nerve to do if I'd thought about it for 1 second longer. The moment I saw the lock pop up, I shoved the door open as hard as I could and half fell, half jumped out of the SUV onto the gravel. My knees hit first, sending a jolt of pain up my thighs, but adrenaline hauled me back onto my feet almost instantly. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase with a shaking hand and dragged it away from the car, putting as much distance between us as the narrow shoulder allowed. Tessa didn't roar off like you might imagine. She didn't come charging after me either. She just sat there for a second, her hands still on the wheel, expression curdled into something that wasn't surprise so much as faint irritation, like I'd deviated from a script she'd really hoped I'd stick to. Then she sighed, turned off the engine, and got out. She walked around to the back of the SUV and popped the trunk. My third horror image lives there. The brief, cinematic flash I caught of the inside before she yanked my suitcase out. There were 3 other bags already in there, all woman's luggage, 2 duffels, and a hard-shell suitcase with airline tags still looped through the handles. Names I didn't recognize, but with destination codes I did. Tucked beside them was a plastic bin with its lid slightly askew. Inside I saw the edge of a folded blanket, a roll of duct tape, and several pairs of cheap, disposable flip-flops still bound together in sets with plastic tags, all the same size. On top of the bin, as if Shed just tossed it there without thinking, was a printed page from the caregiver website. My profile photo at the top, my first name, the list of my skills and experience, and, in the notes, my travel date circled in blue pen. She dropped my suitcase on the side of the road with more force than necessary, then looked over at me. I don't know what my face looked like, but whatever she saw there made her pause. I lifted my phone to my ear, thumb hovering over the emergency call shortcut I'd already pulled up, and shouted that I was on with the police and they were tracking my location. It was a lie, there was still no service, but I said it loud enough that it seemed to land. Her stare went from sharp to flat, like something had been switched off. Without another word, she slammed the trunk, climbed back into the SUV, and drove off, tires spitting gravel, leaving me and my suitcase in a swirl of dust. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then my knees started to shake, so badly I had to sit down in the weeds by the ditch. Eventually, my phone caught a bar of service, then 2. I called my mom first, hands trembling so hard I kept hitting the wrong buttons. She told me to get away from the road, to find somewhere with people, to call 911. I did. The dispatcher's voice was calm and distant, asking me to describe my location as best I could. I read off the faded road number from the bent sign and the last mile marker I remembered seeing. A patrol car found me about 20 minutes later, or it might have been an hour. Time folded strangely in that stretch. The officer who stepped out was younger than I expected, a little skeptical at first, until he looked into the woods where Tessa's car had disappeared, and then at my scraped knees and pale face. He loaded my suitcase into the trunk and drove me back toward the city, radio crackling with codes I didn't understand. I ended up at the apartment of a friend from high school, who happened to be at the nearby college. She and her roommates dragged me inside, wrapped me in a blanket, and put a cup of tea in my hands while I shook and tried to explain what had happened without hyperventilating. Over the next few days, we pieced together what we could. My friends helped me file a report. Eventually, the police called back with what little they'd found. The number Evelyn had used was a prepaid burner, registered under a fake name. The address Shed given me didn't exist in county records. The photos of Lily and Jonah Shed sent during our messages were traced back, with a Google image search, to a parenting blog and a clothing catalog. There was no sign of a real family looking for a nanny in that area. When I asked if they'd found the SUV, or the woman who called herself Tessa, the answer was more complicated. The plate number I'd scribbled, as best I could remember, it belonged to a similar make and model, but the registered owner claimed had sold the vehicle months earlier for cash and had no bill of sale, no name to offer. The officer I spoke to on the phone didn't say the word trafficking, but he didn't have to. He used phrases like bad situation, organized, and you were very smart to get out of that car when you did. Every person I told about it later, from my friend's parents to the counselor at the community center, said the same thing. You were probably minutes away from disappearing. The worst part, the thing that gnawed at me when the adrenaline faded, wasn't just that. It wasted all of the money I had on a bus ticket to nowhere, or that I'd nearly stepped straight into a trap that had been designed to look like my dream. It was that I knew I wasn't the first. Those other bags in the trunk weren't mine. Those scratches on the inside of the door hadn't come from me. That girl in the bus station with the unread message on her phone and the brittle smile, had she gone where I refused to go? Had she gotten out? I'll probably never know. It took time, more time than I wanted to admit, to stop jumping when an unknown number called my phone or a car slowed too long near the bus stop. I went back to Canada with my tail between my legs and my bank account nearly empty, feeling stupid and ashamed and unbelievably lucky all at once. Slowly, with help, I untangled the shame from the survival. Wanting something better for your life isn't naive. I had to remind myself. Trusting the wrong person with that dream doesn't make it your fault. Eventually, I did make my way back toward the Appalachians, this time through a verified program with contracts and background checks and emergency lines that actually picked up when you called. I live in a small mountain town now, not in Kentucky, but in another state along the range, working with kids in an after-school program that feels more honest and solid than anything I could have imagined back then. I'm careful in ways I never used to be. I reverse image search, job listing photos. I insist on meeting kids on video before I commit to anything. I listen to that little voice in my gut when something feels off, even if it makes me look paranoid. I still see that empty intersection in my mind sometimes. The way the SUV looked as it sat idling. The way my suitcase thudded onto the gravel. The way the world tilted when I realized no one would even know where to start looking for me if I vanished there. Writing this isn't just about unloading the memory. It's also my way of pinning up a flare for anyone else who might be scrolling through listings right now, dreaming about a new life in some beautiful faraway place. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And no opportunity is worth silencing the alarm bells in your head. And honestly, I'm curious if you'd been in my shoes. Sitting in that SUV with your phone out of service and the road getting lonelier by the minute, what do you think you would have done? Do you trust your gut? Or do you worry you'd talk yourself into staying polite and going along? If you're comfortable sharing, tell me in the comments how this story lands for you. Or if you've ever had a moment where you realized, too late or just in time, that your dream situation was something much darker underneath.